Hello, and welcome to the Live Balanced podcast, number 2. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better. You notice that I have my headphones on. If you are watching this on YouTube, then you'll be able to see some slides because I'm going to put on my teacher hat today. And we're going to talk about loneliness, Loneliness 101, and I'm going to get this done in less than half an hour, hopefully less than a half an hour, but I'll go with a half hour. I've done this presentation many times, but I wanted to talk about it here on Live Balance. It is a huge part of the energies that I have put forth here in the last couple of years, and I just sort of fell into loneliness, not loneliness myself, but I fell into loneliness research. And I didn't really fall into it. I was pulled in by it because I heard about a statistic that really just alarmed me. And so that's what we're going to do here in this podcast. If you are listening, then whatever you're doing, I hope that you are able to relax and to absorb. And as I talk to you about this, I'm just gonna ask that you think about the times you have experienced loneliness in your life and what was going on. I'm going to give you some research statistics, but loneliness is such a subjective and personal issue for everyone. And that is what makes it tough in research, but that is also what makes the solutions better because you have the tools to make it less. And why am I talking about this right now on the Live Balance podcast? Because we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's been a year of a completely different lifestyle. Many of us have not seen family and friends or loved ones, or we're just now beginning. And that time by ourselves, isolated, may have contributed to feelings of loneliness. And one of the interesting statistics is that I read today that for married couples who had to spend more time together, the time together increased intimacy for most of them. And for singles, it may have made it worse, but there were some mitigating factors. But the other thing we have to think about is that perhaps you are actually having trouble in your relationship or your partnership. And that could be because you're still feeling lonely, even though you're with someone, because it is possible to be alone and not feel lonely, or to be in a crowd and have a partner and feel desperate loneliness. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that means. So thank you for joining me here for the next, however many minutes we have going. So, okay, let's just dive into this. And the other thing, before I dive into loneliness and the presentation for those of you watching, I've got my pad of paper here with me. I have likened loneliness to a type of scar. And I want you to think about that as you're listening, wherever you are, or as you're watching this and you see me here. Loneliness can be a type of scar in our life. Perhaps we experienced a period of intense loneliness. And like a scar, if it gets hit or triggered or bumped and it hasn't fully healed, or even if it has, there is a trace of that wound. And that's what the definition of scar is. One of them in the Oxford English Dictionary is that it is the trace of a healed wound, sore, or a burn. So if you think about a period of time in your life when you felt lonely or when it worsened, that can be triggered just like many other things in our life by events. And those feelings can come back. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that happens physiologically. But as you are listening, I would encourage you, it may be challenging to do this, but to think of that time frame, because when we start talking about how to mitigate it, the beauty, as I said before, is that you have the power to make it better, but it does require you to ask yourself some tough questions and to act upon them. So I created an exercise called Ask and Act based upon my research. You can find a free worksheet that, if you like worksheets, you can find that on my website, www.livebalanced.net, under Resources for Loneliness. So let me talk a little bit about my own scars and why I'm talking about loneliness. My last year of law school, I remember I was leaving a class, and I heard a statistic that lawyers, measured as the loneliest of professionals, followed closely by physicians and dentists and engineers. And I thought that was unique. I thought that was disconcerting. I was in law school, and yet I thought it's something that I could talk about in my doctoral thesis, which is required to graduate. And my background is in well-being. I spent most of my career as a well-being professional, both teaching and in management and business. And law school only came when I was 35, and I went part-time for 4 years, which was a lonely experience. I went through a divorce. I was gone from home. I was learning something new. It was very challenging. And I can understand why lawyers measure as the loneliest of professionals, followed closely by other professionals, because the time that you give to those professions takes life from you and isolates you. Not only isolates you physically, but you have to choose something at the expense of something else. But mentally, you are learning so much information that many people don't learn. And when you have that knowledge, and many of us have the responsibility for other people in these professions, it can feel like a very lonely place. And so I know that more from my experience, but with my well-being background, I feel like I'm in a unique position to help bridge that gap and help people understand, including myself, how to manage it and what loneliness is. And so let's kind of dive into that. And I talked about loneliness being a scar, and you'll see some images pop up here. And I figure, as I said in the Live Balance podcast #1, the best resource I have to share and hopefully help others is my own experience, because I've lived a lot. And by sharing my experience and other people's experiences, we can learn in a safe space. And I'm not afraid to share about these things. So I've had 14 surgeries, and those surgeries in and of themselves are physical. They leave a physical mark. So that's a physical scar, a physical trace of a wound. I've had, if I start from my feet going to my head, I've had 4 ankle surgeries. I had a fracture in my fibula, and I put titanium plate and screws in there. Working my way up, I had also a surgery on the same ankle on the other side. I had 3 knee surgeries. I had 2 spinal surgeries. And instead of going through the back, they went through the front, through my stomach, and cut through all those muscles. And they moved over everything, and they put an artificial cobalt titanium disc in. And that was in 2004. So it's been quite some time. But that left a huge scar on my stomach. And it causes pain, and you get all the little things afterwards. Then I've had right elbow surgery, 3 or 4 shoulder surgeries. The last one, they had to cut me all the way open. You'll see the image pop up. And it just hurts. And most recently, back in May of 2020, I had, you can't see it because the doctor is amazing. I have a nice 4-inch scar in my skull with some titanium screws in there. So those are just my own physical scars. And I think it's important, though, to understand that when I did a poll on Instagram, I said, what type of scars, for those who follow, what type of scars have impacted you the most and been the ones that you have learned something from? And hands down, it was the emotional scars. And yes, it is possible to have a wound to our emotions. We all know it. And part of why I do what I do in my free time with Live Balanced is to help promote and lessen that stigma on mental health, and the fact that you can be wounded emotionally, you can be wounded mentally, you can be wounded in so many other ways other than a physical scar. But for many of us, scars are an opportunity. It happens, whether it happens to us, we've made certain decisions and we found ourselves in an awkward position, or someone has hurt us on purpose or unintentionally. We have to deal with those because we can't undo them, but we can work through them. And there are reminders, and loneliness is one of those things. I experienced intense loneliness in the past, and I notice it gets triggered sometimes. And I've learned to recognize those triggers so that I don't judge myself and think that there's something wrong with me. And that's part of healing. I want to share a story by an individual who offered her perspective on her trauma and her scars. And I'm going to share a little bit of it now and some of it later. But the first thing that Jane said is, My trauma does not define me. And this is an individual who experienced some of the most severe trauma we can experience in our living lifetimes. And so I think that's important though. She's at a point where she says, look, it doesn't define me, but boy, does it feel bad sometimes. So I'll finish the rest of Jane's story, but let's talk about Loneliness 101. We're going to give you the crash course here. And for those of you listening, listen, I'm going to be as succinct as possible, but put your listening ears on. And again, just sort of absorb. Let's get this started here. So I'm going to, okay, I think you should be able to see this for those of you who are listening to this podcast or looking at it later on my YouTube channel. And you should be able to see the screen here that says, ta-da, Loneliness 101. Well, what is loneliness? But let's ask a few questions. And this is something that when you think of loneliness, what does it make you think of? For some of us, that may be shame or judgment or, oh, it's not real, it's a soft thing. Well, in research, it is a qualitative measure, which means that you measure it by what you see in the reporting of emotions, but it's not a number, it's not an occurrence type thing. I will talk a little bit more about something that is, but there's some questions like, when have you really felt part of a group? How often do you feel ostracized from something or feel like you don't fit in and you don't belong? Or maybe you haven't felt and had a joyful activity in a long time. So here's some thinking. Loneliness has to do with our thoughts, and our thoughts are unbelievably powerful. Biologically speaking, if we are thinking of fearful issues, if we're thinking of sadness or we're worrying and ruminating, our body physiologically is going to respond the same way, even if it's not actually happening, but the fear of something. That's one of the issues with anxiety, is we are anxious about something that hasn't happened yet and our body responds. But when's the last time you were like, oh my gosh, I can't do this myself, or I have no idea what I'm doing, or maybe you have an imposter syndrome happens with loneliness a lot and with individuals who are highly educated. You go to school for 10 years and then all of a sudden you're a doctor and you're thinking, I don't know what I'm doing, somebody's going to find me out. That is called imposter syndrome, when you're constantly questioning yourself, or maybe you feel overwhelmed, helpless, or alone. Loneliness is an emotion, and emotions, first of all, are not bad. Let me say that again. Emotions are not bad. How you feel is not bad. Thoughts are thoughts, emotions are emotions. They are they're out there waving signs at you. They're an alert that something is going on. Now, physiologically, the emotions start in your brain. Okay, it's the limbic system. And I'm going to focus on the amygdala, which is where we typically say is your emotion center. Now, I am a biology teacher by licensing, but I'm not a medical doctor. So I think it's important that if you're hearing me today, I encourage you to do your own research. And if you have questions, talk to a licensed professional. Typically, our amygdala, that emotional response, is that response coordinator. It's the one that is like, oh my gosh, I'm running down an alley and somebody surprised me. I'm going to run away, or I'm going to freeze, or I'm just going to fight. And it basically coordinates your entire body system, all from that little amygdala way deep in your brain. People have different responses to emotions, including loneliness. They may fight it. They may fly away from it and run away from it, or you can freeze often. You can just not know what to do. And all of those responses are okay, but they happen because we have something called fear learning. Unfortunately, if we've experienced trauma, and trauma can happen, it's not just something as an assault or like a physical injury, but trauma is an emotional injury in words and what people have done to us and what's happened. Our bodies can learn how to respond in fear learning, and that we are prepared in the event that it happens again, we are ready to go. Unfortunately, we have to choose to use the front of our brain and our thinking to interrupt this cycle. Anger and fear often happen responses in the amygdala, and loneliness is another emotion that can happen. It's not depression, it's not anger, it's not fear. It can cause those things too. And I have said this before, but loneliness, I believe, is the seed from which so many other issues happen with mental health. This is based on my research, and I just recently resubmitted a very long paper, my thesis, and updated it to take to account the pandemic and the fact that we're seeing increased rates of loneliness. So when we think of loneliness, we think of, well, what is it? Well, it's this sort of anathema, sort of, different shades of gray. It's dissatisfying, it's distressing, it's aversive, it's our perception though. What we think matters when it comes to feeling lonely. So it is one of the most toxic environmental conditions we can possibly encounter, is what Stephen Cole from UCLA said. He's a genetics researcher. Think about that. Loneliness, that is our perception of our relationships and what we want them to be and what they are, can be one of the most toxic environmental conditions. And that can happen in our brains. It's happening inside. We can choose to change our environment, but sometimes we can change our environment, or we can be around a lot of people and still feel lonely. So it's like, why is this happening? Now, it's important to understand that loneliness and social isolation are completely different in research. They're interrelated like a Venn diagram. So for those of you watching this later, loneliness and social isolation tend to have a synergy. So we can have a quantitative measurement, like I have 5 friends and I've seen them 5 times in the last 5 weeks. That's a quantitative, that's a numbers. Loneliness is a qualitative. I've got 5 friends. I don't feel close to any of them. I feel lonely. I wish I had a long-term relationship. Why am I alone? I'm too shy. I'm feeling awkward. These are things that persons who tend to have high loneliness scores report. And why does it matter? It matters because the quality of people's relationships is the single clearest predictor of having a physical health, longevity, and quality of life. That's a big deal. Loneliness can be at the core of having a healthy life while you're living, because it has to do with your perception of relationships. Now, I think of loneliness like an iceberg, okay? We have what people see on the top, and it just may be the tip of it. And they may think that what's going on, you're feeling lonely, but underneath, it can be overwhelming and crippling for some individuals. It may just be moderate for some. It may come and go. And like a scar, it may heal, but it might get tripped and it might get hit, it might get reopened, and it can still hurt. So what are the causes of loneliness? Well, generally in the research, we see physical isolation worsens it, lack of companionship, both platonic and romantic, and lack of a useful role in society. Now, I want you to think about what's happened in the last year. Is it a surprise that every single one of us has not had some tick up in loneliness scores? Maybe we're feeling more lonely chronically, or maybe it's just been acute sessions of it. It's okay. So don't feel bad for feeling lonely or wondering what's going on. It's not surprising, especially in the last year. Now, isolation is separation, physical separation we can measure from your familiar contacts or your social network or access to services. This has also been happening in the last year. So now we have both of these combined. So when we look at what loneliness is, I need you to think about yourself. Your personal, subjective sense of lacking those things in your life, companionship, you're isolated, you don't have services, to the extent that you want or need them. So maybe you have a friendship and you have 5 of them, but they're not the depth of friendship that you need. So it is possible to be isolated without being lonely, and to be lonely without being isolated. Now, loneliness can be felt in so many different ways. You can check my paper out if you really want to read it. It's in the appendix, which I suggest. It's actually really interesting reading, but it is a research paper, even though I did try to write it to be absorbed by most audiences. But it comes down to feeling emotionally lonely and socially lonely. So what do I mean by that? Well, we can feel an emotional loneliness, and this is a lack of intimacy. So there's questions on a survey, and this is the survey that I gave to my colleagues back in 2019 for the research I did. And there are questions directed to your emotional loneliness and your social loneliness. So emotion is that want of intimacy. I need to be able to express intimacy with someone. It is a human drive. It is expected. It is good to want that. If you don't want, that's also okay, because people are different in their personalities and their wants. I think it's important, though, to understand if you've had an injury, is that preventing you from getting the intimacy you want as well? So there's lots of things to think about. You may feel emotional loneliness as anxiety and depression, and it can worsen. Note, loneliness is not clinical depression. That's a completely different clinical diagnosis to be made by a professional. So what is social loneliness? Well, we're all certainly feeling this. This is the absence of relationship and a network of friends with common activities. We have got to have people in our lives because we are a social species. This is the evolutionary theory of loneliness. We can feel this as boredom, anxiety, and aimlessness. Now, I'm going to go through what loneliness can feel like in your body. So you're like, I think I'm lonely, or I don't know, or what's this woman talking about? Well, there's something in the research that loneliness and feelings of it, especially high levels of it and chronic, can feel like the same thing as hypervigilance, which is part of post-traumatic stress. And remember, post-traumatic stress doesn't have to be one traumatic event. It could be micro events together. This is where you're constantly on the lookout for a threat and you're hypersensitive to everyone and everything. That can cause, over time, high loneliness can cause increased risk of heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure. It was comparable in the research to smoking cigarettes a pack a day and to being obese, and the effects of being highly lonely on what it does to our hearts and our systems. Remember, we are a system of systems. We are a thinking system, an endocrine system, respiratory, cardiovascular. This can cause us to have increased risk of depressive symptoms, suicidal thoughts, and anxiety, all from loneliness. And this is what the researchers correlations, and that just means that, are we for sure that it causes it? No, but generally speaking, a correlation. The higher the loneliness, the longer it goes on, the worse physical conditioning we have. And also, when you're in poor health, that can increase your loneliness because you're less likely to seek ways to make yourself feel better. Now, you may see loneliness in your daily life as you can't focus on your task, you're irritable, you're missing deadlines, you're sad, you have a hopelessness. And maybe you had activities that you once enjoyed, but you're not enjoying them as much. So these are all warnings. In the research, a researcher from Chicago, his research showed that loneliness is a warning, especially in primates, and we're a primate from a biology perspective. We are meant to be in social groups, and if we are not feeling part of it and we have loneliness, it's a sign that we need to seek counsel and to seek relationships, because we know it's not good to be alone. Now, people are lonely for all kinds of reasons, and there is not one size fits all. And like everything else, we see trends in the research, but generally speaking, those with higher levels of loneliness may feel personality-wise shy or anxious, socially awkward, or maybe came from a weak family system. We also see, and this goes along with my research on lawyers and doctors, the more highly trained you are, you're independent by nature, you have a perfectionist attitude, or you're competitive, we tend to see those individuals report high scores of loneliness. So what's driving this? Well, again, we're each an individual human being with our own thoughts, our own space, and our own personality. So we have to look at the trends and we have to look at ourselves. But society-wise, we do have kind of a self-imposed, we have a self-imposed stigma and isolation because we think loneliness is bad, just like we think we have to do everything by ourselves in North American society and be highly competitive. It is not weak to ask for help, but there's embarrassment of exposure. And then physically, especially in the last year, we're spending a lot of time alone. Maybe we lack control. Maybe we haven't served a useful role in society. We have an intense workload, or we're working a lot. This can all drive and inflate that loneliness score. So the question is, what do we do about it? Well, we have to understand that loneliness group dynamics, there's different theories and different types of loneliness. But I think what I'm going to focus on here is what you can do from your thinking, because you have control over your thoughts. When it comes down to it, anything that pops through your head, you have the ability to look at and dismiss or just gently ignore it. And that's part of the well-being practices I'm going to talk about. And just in case anybody's timing me, I might be close to 30 minutes because I forgot to start my timer, but we're just going to go with it because, hey, this is important and I hope that you're enjoying it. Now, when we talk about loneliness, we have to think about the impact of culture, and culture can be as micro as your home system and what was acceptable in your home, what your parents did or didn't do, or your caregivers. And it can be as macro as North American culture or Western versus Eastern cultures, because in the research, there's differences in how that loneliness is experienced. So what can you actually do to feel less lonely? Well, guys, you've got to take a step out, and that can be incredibly scary. I have friends who have reported to me that they have experienced such sadness that they don't want to get out of bed, they don't want to do anything, but you have to understand something is better than nothing. And if that means getting out of bed and putting on a different set of clothes and that's it, that is something. Now, I want to go back to, before I go into more about what you can do on feeling less lonely, I think what I want to share is the rest of Jane's story. So she said earlier that trauma did not define her life. And I quote, "There may be traumatic effects that linger for a very long time and maybe for the rest of my life. These are days when I have to pause, recognize the feeling, give it space, and then move forward, and that's okay. A pause to breathe is a good thing, and I've learned that not everyone understands the fight or flight response after a traumatic event. I must be true to me. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, and I've let that hold me back in business and my personal life, but I deserve happiness. Our thoughts are powerful, negative or positive. It's our choice to think positively or negatively, and I strive for positive every day because I lived in negativity for too long," unquote. If you think about what Jane just said about her experience of living with the scars that she has endured in her life, physical, mental, and emotional, she is practicing what research is showing is the best way to mitigate that loneliness. And that is to begin to cultivate wisdom, to have consistent time for yourself, whatever that looks like, for taking care of your nutrition and exercise, and creating positive friendships and talking to someone about how you feel. When I say cultivating wisdom, I mean beginning to listen more than talking. That's a very simplistic way of doing it. Beginning to lessen the amount of time you judge both yourself and other people. It's cultivating the ability to be emotionally more sensitive and aware. That will cultivate wisdom. And cultivating wisdom broadens our horizons. And it says, everybody is going through an event. I'm not the only one. I'm not alone. Let me observe without judgment and figure out how I can apply it to my life, or how can I assist someone else without doing it for them. I created the Ask and Act exercise to help individuals cut that cycle from, if you remember back when I showed you the picture of the brain, or I was talking to you about our biological response. This exercise is based on my experience teaching health and wellness and in biology. And it's kind of a combination of basic tenets of cognitive behavioral therapy and interrupting that fight or flight response. We all know what that is. Maybe we're in a meeting and somebody says something and it triggers. And maybe we don't have, remember, your body has an emotional response first before your brain catches up to your frontal cortex to think about how to respond, unless you begin to train it. So as you're going through your day and you're feeling lonely in particular, stop, ask yourself how you're feeling and what can you do about it. So specifically, how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 5, happy face, sad face? Can you identify at least one person with whom you can talk who is a trusted friend who won't judge you? How can you balance your diet and how can you balance your exercise? I threw these in here because if we are taking care of the body that we're in, we're much more likely to be ready when something negative happens. And then what immediate thing can you do to lessen that loneliness? If you identified that you're feeling lonely and you think it's because you haven't spoken to anyone, you can immediately send a text message. We know that that's not optimal when it comes to interacting with people, but it is something. And then I'm going to go over 4 strategies, and I'm going to wrap up here today for this podcast / webinar instruction. So when it comes to loneliness, what can you do? You can practice some well-being things that all are pretty simple. Meditation, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is just talk therapy to a counselor, and inclusion. So it goes from one person. You can do meditation and mindfulness all by yourself throughout the day. Cognitive behavioral requires at least 2 people, and inclusion is more than 2 people. Meditation at its core, and I'm being very simple, you can look this up. Meditation is a focused breathing, and it really focuses on your breathing. And if your breathing becomes shallow, focus on your breathing. We're not focusing on anything else. You can meditate for a minute. You can meditate for 30 seconds. You stop the cycle of that shallow breathing that happens when we become emotionally triggered, whether that's from feeling lonely or upset. Mindfulness is becoming aware of everything in your environment without judging everything about your own thoughts and your own feelings. So that's like the 5 senses. What can I see, smell, taste, hear, touch immediately? And not judging. Cognitive behavioral therapy, talking with a trusted individual, whether that's with a counselor or therapist, they can be a mirror and they can bounce things off of you that you can't even see. I have a therapist. It has been one of the best things that I have done for myself, and I am a trained health professional. You need people in your life to help you see what you can't see in your blind spots. And then last but not least is inclusion. That means providing access equally to resources for those who may be marginalized, and mental health stigmas still abound, but it is getting better. So guys, thank you. I hope that this podcast, Loneliness 101, has helped you at least understand a little bit about what it is, what loneliness is, perhaps why I research loneliness, why I think it's important, how I believe that recognizing it can help other people in your own relationships, and from a professional perspective, help my friends who are attorneys, because I've gone through it and I've seen what it can do. You can reach me at my website at www.livebalance.net. That's LIVBALANCED.net. There you can find my research. You can look at some documents that I've written, some articles I've written. There's a couple more podcasts. I thank you so much. Thank you so very much, everybody. I hope this has been helpful for you. And wherever you are and whatever you're doing, just live balanced, breathe you, seek that balance. And it's the seeking that matters. All right, guys, we'll talk to you next month.